Hello, my name is Michael Byers, and I'm the chair of the Salt Spring Forum, a small community-based charity on Salt Spring Island that usually brings interesting and influential people to the island for community discussions. But because of COVID-19, we've had to shift to a new format and are interviewing guests from off-island using on-island moderators and presenting it to you on YouTube. This COVID-19 series is now into its third month, and I'm presenting today for your watching enjoyment and education a fabulous and thought-provoking discussion between two amazing women. Angela Marie MacDougall is the Executive Director of Battered Women Support Services based in Vancouver, and moderating today, we have Kise Peterson, who is the Executive Director of Islanders Working Against Violence, the equivalent organization in our small community to Battered Women Support Services in the large metropolitan area of Vancouver. It's a phenomenal discussion. I hope that you'll stay to the very end. I learned a lot watching these two amazing people in conversation. And it's obviously a very important topic during these challenging times. Thank you.
On this day, I respectfully acknowledge that I am a settler on Salt Spring Island, which is the traditional territory of the Hulkaminam and the Centrothan-speaking peoples. This island was and is an important place in the lives of many Indigenous people. As well, I recognize the valuable work of Stakea, a group of local Indigenous people, allies, and Cowichan elders who are working to restore cultural activities, education, and land restoration at Kwakwam. Today is a special day where I have the privilege to speak with Angela Marie MacDougall about gender-based violence. Angela is the Executive Director of Battered Women Support Services and is an incredible leader in our work and an advocate for safety and justice. It has been an intense time in our work this year with the pandemic and the impact that it has had on women in abusive relationships. And I'm wondering, Angela, if you could talk a little bit about what you have seen in your work with the Battered Women Support Services.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to be here this afternoon and to have this conversation. I am joining you here on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I really value this opportunity to have this conversation right now about gender-based violence and what we've been learning about how this pandemic that is within a pandemic really taught us some really important lessons during the last few months since we began social distancing and social isolation in March. And in order to talk about what we did at Battered Women Support Services, I have to go back to when I was in China last year. I had the privilege of being able to go to China. I was in Guangzhou and in Hong Kong. But while I was in mainland China, I had the privilege of meeting with activists there, feminist activists, who at that time were doing work around Me Too. We say, do you remember Me Too?
Yes,
it feels like,
yes, 2018,
something.
yes. Yeah, it's amazing where we've come. Mm-hmm.
And so and what's interesting was so much was interesting about that trip, and that was really I learned a lot. But the big thing was the relationships and being able to continue to have those connections. And though there's similarities and very important differences between the way that we do work around ending gender-based violence between these two parts of the world. One of the things that was really vital for me was in thinking about the pandemic and thinking about COVID-19 and watching it unfold in China was about the women that I'd met and being concerned about them. And so having conversations through the various mechanisms that we communicate. And I say that because there are some challenges actually in for the women in China to be able to speak to someone in Vancouver. And so we take great care around that. But what I learned was that that they were receiving reports of increased, well, the isolation was compounding the experiences of domestic violence and sexual violence for women, both in Guangzhou, in Beijing, and that was instructive for us and for me, and so we worked quickly as we could in the beginning of March to start to take action. And that meant a whole bunch of things for us. We grappled with, I think, so many organizations and businesses and families and people did about what to do about the social distancing, just from a professional point of view. What do we do? How do we keep our office open? Do we close? How do we do that? What do we, all of those questions. Well, there was so much social panic. I mean, everyone was so frightened, and there was so much information that we didn't have then about the virus and how to contract the virus and how, transmission, and so we set off on this path of scaling up our services. Well, I always think about it, this idea of us running into the burning building, because we recognized that we needed, if there was going to be reduction in services across the province as everybody was figuring out what to do with the pandemic, and services were closing because they didn't have the ability to offer the service in the same way with the technology. It took some time to be able to get that online. And so what we did was we scaled up our crisis line right away. We became 24 hours, which we did that in a day, which is sort of hilarious looking back at it, but we did it. And then we started getting calls. I mean, we embarked on a social media and a media campaign that we continue. And we started getting calls, lots of calls, and calls from all kinds of people, including victims. I say victims because we can't assume that someone that's experiencing domestic violence is going to survive when they're living with an abusive partner, even after they've left. So I know that word, people don't like that word, but it's real. And so, and we got calls from, women that were dealing with abusive partners. We started getting calls from others that were concerned, neighbors, co-workers. I mean, the work from home changed everything for everybody. And so for many, I know, as I think I do, that we talk to our coworkers about our lives. And so when women are experiencing domestic violence, they will tell their coworkers, and often their coworkers are maybe the only support that they have outside of the house sometimes. So we got calls from coworkers that were worried about someone that they knew. We received calls certainly from friends and family, so family members that were worried about their relative. And everybody was trying to figure out, so what do we do now, recognizing that there's clearly something compounding here with the isolation, and there did feel like a sense of a broader community engagement on this at that moment. And that was new, in a sense. People saw how dire the situation could be for someone that was living with an abusive partner. And what was really amazing was that lots of women left abusive partners during that time. Lots of women left. Not that leaving is always the goal for everybody, but it was quite amazing to see how many women left, and we were really, we appreciated being a part of everybody's journey during that time and today, and for how people were responding and to continue to respond.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I also recognize the importance of outreach. Being out there, I think there was a lot of media internationally, how that would look, and we are seeing those reports from other countries that are a little bit further ahead in terms of the pandemic coming forward, in terms of the impact that it's had for women and children in that environment. During the most restricted phase of the pandemic so far, the message to Canadians has been stay home, stay safe, keep others safe. And what happens for women and children if home is not a safe place?
Yeah, that I wrote letters to the provincial health officer and to elected officials here, in British Columbia, but also in Canada, in our federal government, because I really wanted to see that there, from those levels, from that level, from that platform, for there to be a recognition of that while social distancing and social isolation was important in around the virus and preventing transmission of the virus, we really wanted those leaders to make a statement about victims and for those that are living with abusive partners, and to make a statement that was to say that your physical safety is more important than fear of transmission of the virus, and so to reach out and get support. It took a while for that message to come through. We did hear it eventually, and that was great. But that was the message that we were trying to send, was that in the middle of all this fear, because and you talk about children, and we did get a call from children. We did get calls, and one call in particular was from a young person who had witnessed their mother's abuse since forever by their father, and was calling from the basement of the house, kind of being quiet and just wondering what to do, what options were available for them, and for their mother and for their siblings. And so that is, I wanted there to be enough of that kind of message early on. It didn't happen. And because I think, and I think about how for many of our colleagues around the province and other parts of Canada, that, things got eerily quiet, where there wasn't as much, women weren't reaching out, obviously because they didn't have the opportunity to do so. But I do think it would have been really vital to have had that message about domestic violence, about the isolation, delivered concurrent to all the messages that we're receiving about, the transmission of the virus and social distancing and isolation. And if that's a learning that we can take away, that's what I would like for us to really contemplate, because even the UN commissioner, and I can't remember his name right now, which is embarrassing. I'm not going to try. He made a statement about wanting nation states to recognize that and to prioritize women's safety in the pandemic. And he made that statement early on, from New York, and New York had already shut down at that point. So there's lots to learn about it. The biggest thing, of course, was what we know is that with increased isolation, it plays right into all of the power and control tactics that abusive partners use. And so it was, it's the worst case scenario for domestic violence survivors, victims, to be mandated to stay with an abusive partner during a pandemic. And so that's why it's so, we in looking back at the peak moments, there was an opportunity missed there, I think, for victims to have known what resources are available, to have had that be mainstream, to have some reassurances about what organizations like yours, were doing to help, in terms of transition houses, that to help around transmission. Like, that would have been equally as important as all of the other information that we were getting, given how much of an epidemic domestic violence is.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. It is a really important message to make sure that women don't suffer in that place. And certainly on Salt Spring Island, we found that it was quiet for several weeks, and there was this fear of bringing children to the transition house and getting sick, or risk to others. And we really had to get the message out and continue to that the services still are available. And as everything shut down, I think there was a recognition of, like, are they even open? Can I get help? What can I do? And telephone is such a barrier when you're living in a small space together and constrained. And so certainly this year, one of our lessons for iWave is that we're going to create a chat-enabled aspect for a crisis line in preparation. It'll be beneficial anyway, but also in preparation for a potential second wave as a way of creating additional safety and access. What are other lessons or adaptations that we have learned from this first wave that will help us in this moment where we're reflecting, learning, responding, because the need and the calls are definitely have increased significantly. It's really busy right now. But I think it's important as we look towards the fall or the winter, what are we going to take to make this a much more responsive approach or prepared approach instead of the quick kind of sudden response that we had in March.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're doing it right. I think we moved to a text and email as well, and that was that was really important to be able to have the chat and the text coming.
Mm-hmm.
The one of the biggest things. Well, I think that our sector, the women's movement, the feminist movement, the transition health movement, all of the victim service programs and community-based programs, we have. We're nimble. We do, and we're responsive. And so I think that that's one of the strengths that we have. I think what we need certainly is the support from the government, municipal and provincial and federal governments. They're less nimble. It takes more time for them to kind of move, and so that was a challenge. I think that they should be beginning to kind of plan for this and actually take action in the way that I'm suggesting, in terms of really prioritizing women's safety, in really enhancing that in major ways. And I do love that we've been working across jurisdictions more. I mean, there's more. I think it's already happening anyway, but there's definitely been more connection, collaboration, or at least conversations that have been really focused, and that matters a lot, I think, and that we continue to build our matrix of community based responses to these social problems.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's been really vital. There's so much to say about the fact that our services don't have core funding.
Yeah, 100%. It's a big barrier.
It's jarring and unbelievable to think that, when we know how much of a problem, social problem, gender-based violence is, domestic and sexual violence, and that, we're not core funded. Doesn't make sense, actually, when we're talking about such a, such a large population of humans in this province and in all of the regions in the province. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense, and it's so that's something to continue advocating for, mm-hmm. and to find other ways to get that message across, in light of what we were learning and have learned under COVID-19.
Mm-hmm. I agree that I was really excited when we were being recognized our work as essential services. So I think that as COVID and the pandemic happened, there was a real recognition of what are essential services within our society. And definitely BC Housing and the Transition House, there was a lot of engagement and activity there. And I think I appreciate that. And at the same time, I was hoping that because we were being recognized as essential services, that we would be properly funded, especially for the anti-violence work in terms of outreach, communications, advocacy, and counseling services, which already have been underfunded for decades. And so that's been a real area of disappointment, and continue to look to, is there going to be response from the government to recognize that, okay, we're recognizing you as essential service, and we're showing up for you and making sure you have what you need to do the work that you do. So that is, I hope that the nimbleness can increase, and so that would be in place for us, especially going into this second wave. It's important for me to recognize and acknowledge that our own community during this time has experienced a femicide last month. As you know, this has deeply shaken our island. It's reminded people that violence and abuse happens everywhere, including our island. Could you speak to the rise of femicide as one of the outcomes of the pandemic?
Yeah, when we talked earlier this week, I was talking about that I have family in Salt Spring Island, and I would go to Salt Spring Island during the summertime. And so I know the island. As I was growing up, I would go every summer. And I have cousins that are there right now, that live there right now. So I have, Salt Spring is always in my heart, and because of, knowing the island, I can see the land and have a sense of the land. And so when there was a killing, Jennifer Quinnell was killed, my heart broke for the community. Well, obviously for her and for her family, and for the community, and having a sense of how, close knit in a sense the community is, and what that would mean. And what was remarkable, what we started to track during this time was a spike in femicide under COVID. We had a statistical spike. I mean, the stats say about every 5 days, every 6 days, a woman in Canada is killed by her male partner. And that, that was shortened a bit. I'm not a statistician, but it was a lot of killing of women during a short period of time. We tracked 14 women that were killed within a 7-week period, including Jennifer. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that, and what was another factor was also that many of the women that were killed were in smaller communities. Communities that would probably say, not unlike maybe what people in Salt Spring were saying, is how could this happen here? And it, that's one of that we look at what we should be. I mean, one of the things that we should be looking at and thinking about in terms of a second wave is also understanding the femicides that have happened. And unfortunately, that doesn't appear. Nobody's really looking at that yet. It doesn't appear to be. It's something, that I think the policy and the researchers should take a look at, and we should have conversations ourselves within our work to kind of understand that, and kind of understand the conditions and what was happening in women's lives and girls' lives, because in some instances it was, children were killed as well. So it's the ultimate expression of power and control to kill another, and we see that in abusive relationships where lethality it's there for so many women. And we, of course, as you know, we take great efforts to assess risk when every time that we have someone that comes to us that looks for help, is that we want to kind of understand the risk, and we do lethality assessments and safety assessments, and we're threat assessments, and we're thinking about all of those things. And for so many women that are killed, they're not connected to a community-based organization like ours. And that is why it's so important that the community-based responses, make a difference in helping women and children be safe, and also to help create communities of care. And that is a vital lesson for us in to understand our role. We should be really recognized for the safety that we offer. That's different than other systems, because we're in community, and we can connect victim survivors in a whole bunch of ways, and help women be safer because of the safety assessments and plans that we have, that we can that we can support. And so it's a professional kind of thing for me to every time a woman's killed in Canada, I start to investigate what was behind that. there's so much in that for us as a country and as a people, as a society, to understand the roots of violence and that expression, that particular expression of femicide that is a part of domestic violence. So, for, as you know, so many women are, for every woman that's killed, so many more are living in fear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's so true. Yeah. I really recognize the impact that it's had in our community, and it also has elevated the conversations around what can we do, how can we support, and recognizing that domestic violence is in all communities, and the goal of community-based providers is really to support our communities in this time, to do those risk assessments, to reach out, to support, and also to educate. So I really value your perspective on that, and also have been watching the significant increase, that spike. Again, it's one of the things that kind of propels us in terms of this work and getting prepared again for this next wave. What will make the difference for women to access services? How will they be supported and fully understand the risks at this time? It's very important. I've got one more question, and then we'll move on to the community questions, because there's a lot of engagement. But I do think it's really important to recognize that we're at a really poignant time in our society. In North America, there has been significant rise in action and awareness and conversation. But the action against the systemic racism in our system and recognition of injustices and barriers that this creates. I'd like to invite you to talk about the systemic barriers or layers of discrimination that affect women experiencing gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, and how that gets layered over.
Yeah, it is a really remarkable time. We haven't seen this much attention spent in a global sense, looking at colonization and the enslavement of Africans, and the impacts and legacies. And so it's all around the world. I mean, to see the statues of slavers come down in Europe, and mm-hmm. All of the stuff that we see in the United States with respect to Confederate flags and monuments. And so, and then of course, all of the Indigenous organizing that's been happening around colonization, and I live in Gastown in Vancouver, which is named after John Denton, who is one of the settlers, colonialists in Vancouver, the first shaping of Vancouver as a city. And he has a storied life. Mostly people know him as someone that has a bar, but he also had two wives, Indigenous women that were wives, girls, I should say. One was a girl, and so his first wife, her name is lost to history. His second wife was 12 years old when they were married, and her name is Clahalia. She was Squamish woman. She died in her 90s. And we've been unraveling the history of the making of these nations, and understanding the rules of colonization and the enslavement of Africans. Canada had enslavement of Africans and Indigenous people, and it may not have been the same economic driver in Canada as it was in terms of enslavement, as it was in other parts of the world, in the United States and in the Caribbean and in Latin America and South America. But in terms of how much wealth that enslavement of Africans and the removal of Indigenous people off the lands, and how much wealth that generated for Europe mm-hmm. and for the United States. And then what has been baked in to our nation states through that process. So what that means on the ground is that this time right now with Black Lives Matter as a rallying call, it's given us a chance to examine our history, and in a very important way. And what we've been talking about as an organization, as a Black woman, my father, my paternal family comes from West Africa, from Ghana, And I was talking about my mother's family. My maternal family comes from Sweden. And so as a Black woman and being raised in Vancouver, that has a history of displacing Black people. There's a municipal policy that removed the only Black community that was in Vancouver in the 70s through the municipal policy. The community is called Hogan's Alley. And that's actually where my parents met back in the day. As a Black woman in Canada, it's been very vital to understand our experiences and the experiences of women from an intersectional point of view. Intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a law scholar, an African-American woman. And she talked about intersectionality and kind of understanding how social identities such as race and class and gender intersect and compound. And so what we've been talking about at Battered Women Support Services, at least since the 90s, but certainly in the last 17 years or so, is understanding our world from an intersectional point of view, which is to say that there is no universal woman in Canada, and that our life experiences of women as women are shaped by gender, the gender binary. Mm-hmm. All of the stuff around race, and Canada struggled in a big way to recognize that that race is a factor in Canadian society. We've often looked to the United States as being the problem where all of the problems with race are. We have not been willing necessarily until maybe now to look at Canada and look at race and racism and particular versions of racism, such as anti-Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism as kind of the unique qualities. We, Battered Women Support Services, we supported some action that's happened here in Vancouver that was looking at the role of policing. And we supported an initiative that was about police checks. And in Vancouver, the amount of Indigenous and Black people that are stopped by the police for seemingly no reason. And what people probably wouldn't know is that for women that access our services, Indigenous women, immigrant women of color, Black women who have left our organization, who are just going off down the street to catch the bus or go pick up their children, have been stopped by the police for no reason, that seemingly reason, no legitimate reason, and in some occasions have been arrested wrongfully. And even a recent case, which I won't go into details because it would be too identifying, but it was an Indigenous woman who had left our organization and was making her way to the public transportation. And next thing you know, she's in jail of course she was released, but so there's ranges of kinds of impacts that race have and the ways that the things that we experience that is just based on the amount of melanin that we have in our skin. And so the services and the risk is compounded because of that being oppressed by race as well as by gender, and what that means in terms of being able to access services. It is having access and then the kind of services that are available. And so we're always working really hard to center the experiences of women of color, Black women, Indigenous women. It can give us a lot of information about how the domestic violence and gender-based violence, how it operates, and how ill-equipped in some senses we are as a society in keeping women safe because of the ways in which women are marginalized and oppressed as through the function of Canadian society that is centered European skin color and ways of being, worldview.
Thank you, Angela. I also, my experience, I'm a third generation Japanese Canadian and Danish, so biracial from that perspective, and have been watching the rise of anti-Asian discrimination and during this time as a response to the pandemic, and it's really raised that, reawakened that reminder that the impacts that racism and discrimination and assumptions and just this labeling really have in terms of creating barriers, creating angriness and violence. It really has been apparent in lots of ways. I would also say in the last 2 decades, but especially in this last 5 to 10 years, there's been a real recognition in our sector of the impact for Indigenous women in terms of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Great recommendations coming forward in terms of things that can be changed. But as you talk about John Denton and the legacy at that time, it is that piece of watching resource development and in communities where there are Indigenous communities and the impact that wealth extraction and has at making it a riskier and unsafe environment for Indigenous women and girls. So it is something that isn't outside of the scope of just this time, but we're seeing such a awakening and activation of these systemic components for so many years. Thank you. I'm going to shift over to the questions that were received through the community. There's been some of the questions that have been asked have been answered or been responded to in our conversation. What I would like to start off with, though, is kind of getting back to that idea of risk assessment. And when people are doing, people often look at their own risk and maybe don't assess it fully. There's a question from somebody anonymous on Salt Spring Island. What types of behavior do victims not think of as domestic abuse by their partners and that they should take more seriously?
Yeah, there's so much that is been normalized within a patriarchal society like Canada that just goes unnoticed for so many of us. And Canada, as was colonized by England and France, and as we have the culture has been based on English ways and values, and even our law is based on British common law, which had for a time women as property, the property of men, property of their fathers and then their husbands through the marriage contract. And so that's been baked into Canada, the patriarchal ideas. Every once in a while, not so much now, but every once in a while, like we'll, and it's always so beautiful to, with Battered Sources, we'll get a donation from someone, and it'll be from a woman, and it's that kind of cursive writing that is rare to see these days, and she'll refer to herself as Mrs. Fred Anderson. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that wasn't too long ago. I mean, it's that that where we became the identity of our husbands, and that we didn't have our own identity. So that in of itself, is oppression and isolation, and it's invisibility, and it's controlling, and it's so many things that are a part of that. So there's so much that's been normalized in everyday heterosexuality that we're trying to disrupt that through our work, is trying to disrupt that and create more equitable and society. So the question about I always like to think about isolation as being like sort of the first way in which an abusive relationship starts. It can happen very, very subtly and almost without question, so it's difficult to kind of name. And it can be things like not, and it can look like just being attentive or caring, but it ends up being controlling. And it's things like questioning where she's gone and how long that she's been gone, limiting her access to friends and to family and to the time that she spends outside of the house, which is also by COVID-19 is so been so powerful in contributing to more entrapment. But isolation it happens so early on in a relationship, and then emotional abuse. And I like to think of emotional abuse, and just to kind of keep it simple, is anything that makes you feel bad about yourself or makes you feel crazy. So criticizing, name calling. There's really no shortage of ways to criticize. And so, because as women we are socialized to spend a lot of time on how we look, and men have been socialized to think that how we look is what is really important about us, that there's so many ways to criticize a woman about how she looks, in terms of being too skinny, too fat, the whole range of things, and comparing women to others. And so there's all kinds of very subtle ways in which criticism can come into a relationship. And then just straight up name calling, calling someone names. I'm not going to say the names because but they're all the names you can imagine. Calling, though you can have an extraordinarily abusive relationship with isolation and with emotional abuse, and nobody's been hit. There's no physical abuse. And so what we've been wanting to do really is to change where we draw the line. Of course, we've been drawing the line around physical and sexual violence, of course, and that is in part because we're tied to the criminal system, and it's sort of what is a crime and what can be prosecuted. And so we've been wanting to move that line to looking at isolation and to looking at emotional abuse. Just those two alone are very, very vital, and often not noticed because of how subtle it can be, and how they compound over time.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Another question is from an anonymous person on Salt Spring Island. How helpful is it to have the police involved in domestic abuse cases? Should victims call the police, and if not, where can they turn for help in an emergency?
This is such an interesting question right now at this time, and I'm kind of. We're having this question. We've been having this question about the role of policing in domestic violence. I mean, so yes. I mean, we believe, and we've talked often for years about the role of policing, because we wanted to recognize that domestic violence was not okay. And so by making it a crime, by pointing to it in terms of being a common assault and wanting the police to prosecute it, to action it, was something that we wanted to do in order to recognize that this is a social problem that has criminal implications. And so that was a big part of work that I know that our organization did, Battered Women Support Services, and others in the province of British Columbia and in Canada and around the world, was to help police do their job by asking them to not just tell the abusive partner to go around the block, leave and go around the block, but to actually take action and to help a woman be safer by removing an abusive man and having him, face consequences for his behavior. So we've got policies in place that police are to follow, that define their behavior when they arrive at a domestic violence situation, how they're supposed to investigate, how what they're supposed to do when they arrive, how they talk to the parties, different actions that they're supposed to take. And so we've been really working since the 90s with those policies to try and hold police accountable for those policies and those actions. And then they struggle to follow their own policies and to do their policies effectively, to do the investigations. It's a challenge. And a lot of our work at Battered Women Support Services ends up being trying to have them follow their procedures, to do a proper investigation, and to interview the victim, and to talk to neighbors, and to talk to the doctor, look for the medical reports, like to do a proper investigation, and they tend not to. So it's tough. And then, of course, we have the circumstances, and we started tracking this in 2008, where women were being wrongfully arrested for allegedly perpetrating domestic violence when the police showed up. If the police showed up and they couldn't maybe decide who was, who did what to who, and they would arrest those people. Or in certain instances that we were seeing, and some jurisdictions were kind of more problematic than others in terms of RCMP jurisdictions, they were arresting women for wrongfully. And we would be having to follow that up. And it had really serious consequences for women. And I want you to know that the women tended to be Indigenous women and immigrant women of color were by far the most who were being arrested wrongfully. And it causes so many problems because then women wouldn't be eligible for victim services. Often the charges would be stayed or not, wouldn't be, they would be arrested and there wouldn't be charges. Like they would be stayed or the Crown wouldn't approve charges. But sometimes women had their children go into care because there's children in the house, the woman's arrested, the children go into care, and then the woman has to work for months to try and get the children back, even though there was a mistake, like the police made a mistake. So we've been, I always say that we have a complicated relationship with the police. There is, there is a real piece around having an authority figure show up when there's an abusive partners being abusive, and an authority figure such as the police shows up and can be a resource in that instance to kind of be the one that has more power than the abusive partner. And the problem is that they tend not to follow through on their own policies in terms of police. So if that ends up being a real challenge that we've seen. And for many communities, particularly communities of color, there is a reluctance to involve police. For lots of reasons, but including a real sense of loyalty for some women, Indigenous women, women of color, that are dealing with sort of broad racism and white supremacy just in general, not wanting to involve what would be a representative of the state and therefore the white supremacist state to come and kind of get involved in the family. And so not necessarily seeing the police as an option because it feels like such a betrayal to involve this, the system that, and so that's a factor. I do like that right now we are spending time talking about policing and asking some questions about what do they do well. I think that we've had some hesitancy, though, to talk about their role in domestic violence. And so the question that's coming from today is really interesting because I think we've been nervous to have that conversation because of a sense that there could be a further chilling effect for women if they, to not call. And what we know is often women don't call. It's usually a neighbor, might be or somebody that's overheard something that ends up being a caller, not necessarily the woman. I'm reading this book actually right now that we're talking. It's called Police Life, and it's actually a story. It's about police that are perpetrating domestic violence.
Wow.
And
yes.
There's lots there. This is a conversation that we should be having, I think, more of, is actually right now digging into the role of policing and domestic violence. We never dissuade women from calling 911 to involve. We never dissuade women from doing that. We work to hold police accountable for their role in investigating, and we're happy when it goes well. Mm-hmm. And we like to hold them accountable when it doesn't.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate your perspective on that and sharing the additional information. And I know you have years of experience in this sector, so seeing where things are working and haven't been working. I would add also the importance for collaboration with community-based service providers in terms of sharing referrals, and working collaboratively. Our staff, as I know other staff in the sector, will support women in paperwork or accompaniments to support them in that process so that they aren't alone feeling uncertain about, whether they're going to be heard or how they're responded to and what next steps will come. So it is important as we move forward to really look at those partnerships. What is the relationship and how are we working towards a common goal supporting women and children in this time. I recognize we've got lots of conversation, lots of questions. I have a few final questions that are important that I would like to have carried forward before we wrap up. We've talked a lot about women. And, when we're speaking of women, it is this conversation of being inclusive of women who are cis women, trans women, gender nonconforming. So just as an additional piece, but we haven't necessarily talked about children in this time. And so I would like sort of your perspective on where child abuse, so from Catherine on Salt Spring Island, where does child abuse fit into this picture, and how should children seek help? And I would add to that, this extra exponential sense of isolation for children during the pandemic. What would you like to say to that?
Yeah, children are so vulnerable because, of course, relying on adults for everything, and so and what we know, and that children are witnessing their mother's abuse, and that is trauma, and it's devastating, and the levels of incest continue to be high. We have therapists that work with us and counselors, and we are working with children, and also working with youth, and so we are seeing all kinds of things in families. And so where does it fit in? We need to do a whole lot more in raising the awareness of the role of child abuse, and thinking about it in terms of in the ways that we've been doing it in within our sector. I think that we should be looking at how and talking increasingly about the vulnerability of children and the role then of supporting the family, in particular the mother, in being safe and being safer. Children, when I remember that, talking with my coworker about the young people that called during COVID that were, wanting to know what they could do. That's a big thing, is to ensure that we've got resources, that phone lines, chat, possibilities with trained people on the other end that can make that meaningful engagement, and to be able to help work through a safety plan and help assess and then also where necessary and possible, help a child be safer. And that it's very difficult because, as children rely on adults. What is wonderful, however, in that is that the role of the internet and the ability to access information. And I know that where you've been talking to young people, and they have a lot of information, they're able to access information. It doesn't necessarily mean that the problems go away, but there is a sense of how to, that there's other methods than even 20 years ago, in terms of being able to know what problems, or even to be able to connect through, to build a community online, in terms of friends and others. So there's vulnerabilities and there's resources. And I want us, and we're thinking about the second wave, is to center, our conversations on children, and in domestic violence context, and what we can do to support mothers and families in ensuring that children are safe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. I recognize one of the challenges of having this pandemic is for children is the isolation and being outside of the school system and being at home. And, school is often a safe place, and there's a trusted adult there. And so as preparation for the second wave, I think there's that continual, or that growth in the partnership with the educators, because they are having that contact with children, and especially with younger children who aren't necessarily able to have access to the same technology as youth would. So there is that potential again for connection and safety and information sharing.
That could be something like that. When I think Vancouver, it's maybe a little bit harder because of just the size. But I wonder, like small in communities that are rural or smaller, that might be a thing to build in. But then as I'm thinking about how we can do that in Vancouver as well, but yes, we should be paying attention. And thank you for highlighting the part around children being at home and away from school, and just the kind of pressure cooker that everybody's been under.
Yeah, it definitely impacts them in a big way. Yeah. And it is interesting, rural and city, we have different skills and resources and different possibilities. And I would say in our small community, there is a real strong relationship with the school district and lots of great advocates for kids in that system. I have one final question. What do anti-violence organizations need from the government and the community to continue our work in supporting women every day?
Yeah, and I didn't mention this in the police question, but I bring it up now. I'm not sure about, for the community-based programs that have victim services, we are tied to public safety.
Yes.
And tied to the Solicitor General. So we're all in the kind of the policing and public safety umbrella. And there's some conversations that we're having, and it's mostly happening around sexual violence and sexual assault, and that is about moving more toward around health, and within an understanding this around health. I know that for transition houses here within BC Housing, so much of our government is really based on the silo that we're in, based on the funding stream, and then the kind of values or the mission, the approach that each of those funding streams, that those government entities, what their priorities are. And so I believe very much that we should look at the role of policing, and that should be something the government should do right now, and also about victim services being tied to police in that way. That look if there's other ways that we can can build, recognizing that most domestic violence doesn't go to the police. It actually comes to organizations like us, or there isn't support. So we want to build a broader base knowledge and awareness of the community-based organizations, which leads to the other point, which is about core funding. That is so necessary. We should not be we should be core funded, and what that basically means is such as healthcare. Which has, healthcare services are funded. It's just part of a regular, it has its own area of funding, and they're funded, and each year for an organization like us, we have to apply. And we're not considered sort of a core service, a core resource for. So I think that's just really important that we move in that direction for core funding. That was something that I would do if I had the ability to change things. That would be one of the things I'd do right away, is to ensure that we're prioritizing ending gender-based violence, and through that having core funding, and then building really strong and important communication awareness campaigns that would be sustained and be embedded in all aspects. So through the school system, through employers, employment, it wouldn't be an add-on; it would be a part of it. And then to have resources available, increase resources. So there's some easy. Right now I know that, and I was watching the premier today and talking about the economy and getting the economy moving. And COVID-19 was really hard on women. The shutdown was really hard on women and work that is done by women. And so there's lots of things that we can do, I think, in the within British Columbia and within Canada, that would be about building more equity within our human relations and within our systems. And that is looking at it from an intersectional point of view. And we're at a really important time to do that. The pandemic has given us this opportunity to do this. And the question is how we can continue to advance that.
Thank you. I recognize the importance of core funding in this work, especially in light of the other fundraising that organizations have to do to offset the lack of core funding. I know for Battered Women Support Services, you have a thrift store that was closed during the pandemic. We also have had that. And as well, fundraisers have to be modified or adjusted. So it's going to be I think, a difficult year for many organizations working in anti-violence work because of that. So I really do also recognize the importance of government funding and community support for our work. I'm going to wrap it up there, and would really like to thank all of the questions, the people that sent in their questions, and the opportunity for us to have this rich and really meaningful conversation today. My takeaway really is, this next step of learning from this time and what we continue to do as we move forward, and recognizing definitely the layers impacted by systemic barriers for women experiencing gender-based violence. So thank you, Angela, so much for this conversation. I really have appreciated your wise and powerful words and your wisdom in this time. So,
oh my goodness, thank you for this opportunity. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you, Kisei. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And as well, thank you to the Salt Spring Forum for this opportunity, for showing up and showing leadership in this conversation. It's been very important. And lastly, I would thank iWave. I work for Islanders Working Against Violence, and for our staff and our team in terms of being able to do this work locally. So thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.